I've finally gotten around to writing down a pretty frightening event that happened to me when I was in secondary school, which is what us Brits call high school. It's a bit of a wild one, and it's definitely a long one too, so I hope it's not too tough to get through. I had a pretty rough time in high school. Well, all my little circle of friends did, but for reasons that will become obvious, I'd say that I had it a little worse than even they did. We were like the goth skater crew that grew their hair long, listened to heavy music, wore flannel and Marilyn Manson hoodies. You get the idea. And this obviously meant that, being the alternative kids, we ended up getting picked on an awful lot. The main group of bullies we had to deal with were, ironically, not the jock rugby players who were actually capable of beating us to a pulp. It was a group of 3 girls who we used to not so affectionately call the 3 witches. This caused some consternation in our little group, as to us, being called a witch was hardly an insult. But I suppose that once a few of us referred to them by that name a few times, it just stuck. Given that they were girls, and no offense to any ladies listening, but they weren't exactly capable of physically overpowering us. So instead, they had to get way more creative with their harassment and emotional torture. Think like pouring cafeteria food or milk in our bags, spreading rumors about us and that sort of thing. They also liked to dole out a fair bit of verbal abuse too, which we'd mostly just ignored out of not wanting them to escalate their little hate campaign. But one day, I got particularly sick of it and decided to give one of them what for. Not physically, obviously, because the girl in question was 5 foot who knows what, only verbally. The main perpetrator, and by that I mean the gobbiest one, started giving it loads one day about how we were all losers and loners and stinking skater trash, so I just looked up at her and said something I've been saving for a particularly rainy day. "Your dentist must make an absolute fortune off you," I said, and the way it completely silenced her was absolutely golden. She asked me to repeat myself, I think genuinely because she couldn't believe that I'd actually given her a bit back for once. I didn't repeat myself. I just said the next thing that came to mind. "Did your dad shag a great white shark or something? Because I swear you have more teeth in your head than the rest of us." My mates are just soiling themselves laughing at this point, and I think mainly out of pure shock that I actually had the bollocks to say it. I'm not going to pretend it was pure wit that had me coming out with stuff like that, as I'd literally been fantasizing about knocking her down a peg or two for months. So those were some carefully crafted insults that I honestly never thought I'd ever use on her. She went bright red, and even her friends were completely stunned that one of us had dared to defend ourselves. Feeling good about it only lasted like a millisecond though, as I suddenly realized that she might just start retaliating with nuclear intensity. She didn't though. She just marched off in a huff and left us to celebrate our small victory. I had a feeling though, a horrible feeling in my gut that the retaliation would come later and would still be atomic in scale. And I was right. I just had no idea how effective or how psychotic it'd turn out to be. It happened during lunch break the next day, right at the end of it too. I was separated from my little crew, having been stuck in detention for the majority of the lunch break. Then when it was over, we had a 20-minute window to go get some lunch before the cafeteria closed. I remember getting out, walking out of the languages area where the detention had been held, then making my way towards the dinner hall. I'm sorry to get all geographical on you all of a sudden, but you need to understand that there were 2 corners between me and the dinner hall. If it had been a straight path, I'd have seen what was coming a mile off, but it wasn't, so I rounded one corner and walked towards the other. I was walking right into the middle of an absolute maelstrom of trouble. Right as I was getting to the other corner, this huge gang of kids from my year came around the corner, and all I heard was, "There he is." As the head of the pack was the toothiest of the 3 witches, and she's pointing right at me, not with an angry look on her face because of what I'd said to her the day before, but with like this evil-looking, satisfied grin. She might have just had her lunch, but she found what she was hungry for, and her expression perfectly reflected it. But in taking note of her expression, I noticed something else about her face. She had this little cut just above her eyebrow, and There was a little trickle of blood that had run down just to the side of her eye. I didn't have time to really take it in though, because almost as soon as she'd shouted and pointed, and I'd noticed the cut, the pack charged me. I didn't exactly want to hang around to find out what was going on, and as it didn't take a genius that they were angry, and for some reason, I was the target of their anger. I just legged it. Not sure where I was legging it to, I just wanted to get away from the mob. Then, in pure stupidity, I ran behind the back of the languages block where there was a little alley type thing, thinking I might be able to hide from them. Obviously, they'd all seen me running back there, and all I'd done was trap myself into a corner. When the mob descended on me, the lads at the front didn't immediately start hitting me. Instead, they said something that had me crying out in confusion. They were shouting things like, "Hit a girl, did ya? And why don't you try and hit me, eh, big man? Why don't you hit someone your own size?" And all this other stuff. While I'm crying out that I have zero clue what they're on about, the realization hits me like a ton of bricks. I don't know what happened to the toothy witch girl, but something had obviously happened to her, and she was blaming it on me. The lads only got a few kicks and punches in on me before I heard the sound of a teacher's voice shouting at them to get off me and to disappear, as she put it. I thought that was me rescued, but then once the mob had dispersed under the threat of expulsion, the teacher basically grabbed me by the arm and carted me off to the head teacher's office while saying, "You got a lot of explaining to do." I had a good idea of what I was about to be accused of, but I reckoned that it was pointless protesting until I was actually in front of the head. Minutes later, I found out that my assumptions were right, and that I was formally being accused of having punched the toothy witch girl so hard it had split her eyebrow open. They were probably expecting me to deny it, innocent or not, so my initial protest didn't seem to make a dent. They just took their time explaining to me that a full investigation would be undertaken, which would involve the police, and that in the meantime, I'd be suspended while they waited for the results of said investigation. And so, that was that. I was escorted to my locker, told to get what I needed to complete homework, etc., then escorted off the property. I had to get updates from my little group of mates via phone, but the news was all stuff you can probably guess. The three witches were all insisting that I just walked up to them, out of the blue, before punching Toothy One right in the eye. If they'd given a reason for the punch or what led up to it, we certainly didn't know about it, but they were saying that there had been no other witnesses but them, and that the punch had occurred in a place where there were no cameras, and somewhere down by the school playing field. I remember a friend of mine saying, "It looks like you're screwed, mate." And the worst thing was, I got the impression that some of them genuinely believed I'd done it. One or two were on my side with the whole thing and didn't doubt that she was horrible enough to have done it to herself or whatever, but proving it was a completely different story. 3 days into my suspension, my mom got a phone call which she took in the kitchen. It was the same deal with my parents too. By the way, they obviously didn't want to believe that I'd hit a girl, but they were also clever enough to keep an open mind about the whole thing until they had the facts. That was the part that really got to me. The idea that my mom was thinking my son might be a woman beater. Emphasis on might, but you could tell she abhorred a few grains of doubt when I swore blind to her that I was completely innocent. So she gets the call, and I can hear her talking downstairs when I was up in my room. Then she hangs up the phone, she walks upstairs and says, "Get dressed and showered. The police are on their way round." I won't go into too much detail about the police interview, but I could tell things were starting to look up. One of them, this nice policewoman, seemed to be completely on my side once I'd explained the whole thing, how I'd insulted the girl the day before, how there had been a long-running feud between us, how they were complete bullies, and as much as I hated them, I'd never raised my fist to a girl. But even she said that unless I could provide an alibi concerning where I was at the start of lunchtime, I'd look like a proper villain if the whole thing went to court, which by the sounds of things, the toothy girl was very keen on. I knew I just left class and was on my way to detention, but I'm not sure who saw me, or who would actually be up for saying that I couldn't have hit her because I wasn't where she said I was. The policewoman made me a promise though, and that was how she'd be going into the school to talk to an assembly which the whole school would be attending. She'd make a plea on my behalf, for anyone who'd seen me at the start of lunch break to come forward, as it was obviously a very serious matter and that someone needed to do the right thing. But she also said she'd be asking anyone who'd seen me punch the girl to come forward too. And that really did scare me, because if Toothy Witch Girl could convince someone else to lie for her, I'd be done for. Thankfully, it didn't come to that, and what happened next I honestly considered a kind of miracle. Literally the same day that the policewoman made her address to the assembly, someone who wished to remain anonymous went to the head teacher's office with a kind of confession. They'd witnessed the punch that had caused the wound over the girl's eyebrow, but it wasn't me that had done the punching. It was a boy that didn't even go to our school. The person had been walking through the school's car park, around the back of the school, one that was open to the public because the school's gym was also open to the public. She'd seen the witch girl getting into someone's car, that someone being an older boy she didn't even recognize. And being a bit of a nosy gossip, she slowed her pace to see who the guy was, if witch girl was about to engage in a bit of necking or whatever, and that way she'd have the gossip on if witch girl had an older boyfriend or whatever. Only instead of, doing a bit of knobbing, she watched the witch girl say something all animated to the guy, like she was pleading with him to do something. Then, he hit her, and then from what I understand, she motioned for him to do it again. He hit her over and over again until she finally brought a hand up to her eye, obviously when it had split the skin above her eyebrow. Now, this was on the school's security cameras, not the actual punch, but they caught the girl walking down into the car park before getting into the mystery guy's car. That was all that was explained during the aftermath, and I don't actually know if the girl wanted him to hit her so she could fake it like it was me, or if he was actually abusing her and she just conveniently pinned it on me so she'd have an explanation for her parents. The last update I got before I was allowed to come back to school was that witch girl had been expelled for making the false accusation, as obviously it could have literally ended with a spell in a young offenders institution for me. Her mates, who'd backed up her lie, were just suspended, I think because they claimed she just talked them into it and were really sorry and all that jazz. I'd like to have seen them expelled too, but hey ho, that's life. After that, all I heard were rumors, so as much as I can't confirm any of this, I'll share them with you anyway. We heard that the toothy witch girl changed her story, told everyone that the boyfriend was hitting her, and she said she was so scared of him that she'd been forced to blame me just to protect herself. The police then went round to this bloke's flat, nicked him, then took him down to the police station where he claimed she'd talked him into it and that he never wanted to hit her in the first place. I don't know if they believed him or not, but I'm pretty sure the girl's parents wanted to press charges, and I believe that bit because, I'd want him charged too if he hit my daughter, whether he was talked into it or not. We didn't see anything about it in the papers though, and by that point, we didn't really care what happened to either of them, as me and my mates were too busy reveling in the fact that she'd been expelled and was out of our hair. I remember being a bit scared that she and this fella would end up tracking me down or waiting for me outside of school or whatever, but nothing like that ended up happening, so after a while, we all just moved on. For me, the hero of the story is obviously the anonymous person who came forward with the truth about what they'd seen in the car. I went through my last 18 months in that school just never knowing who it was. I have my suspicions about who it might have been, but they never actually revealed themselves to me. I always figured they might do, like right at the end of school or something, just to get a little bit of glory and appreciation, but they never did. They just kept quiet and remained my silent savior. And that's the end of my story. Not exactly terrifying, but I'm sure you can understand why the whole thing was so bloody scary for me. It was a harrowing, sickening, and terrifying experience, and I honestly wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Back when I was in high school, we had this really weird, kind of creepy kid in our grade who was always a real loner. Sometimes you'd catch the kid talking to himself while going through his locker, and not like casually commenting on things to himself like we all do sometimes. I'm talking like just standing there, staring into the darkness of his locker, just mumbling things nonstop to himself, creepy stuff like that. Anyway, I'm not sure if kids still do it today, but back when I was in high school, we used to dissect frogs in biology class. I remember really not looking forward to it, but I didn't want to fail the class, so I figured I'd just kind of suck it up and get it over with so I wouldn't have to repeat the whole grade and do it again. So we're there, cutting up the frogs, removing the organs, and then making a note of which ones they were. You know, like heart, liver, lungs, the whole shebang. Then out of nowhere, this one girl starts screaming, like this real blood-curdling scream, as they say, the kind that runs right through you just to hear it. Everyone looks around and there's the loner kid with blood on his lips. I swear to God, I watched with my own two eyes as the kid reached down into the open chest of his frog, pulled out one of the organs, not sure which one, then put it in his mouth and started to chew. It wasn't even that he was eating the frog's insides, it was the look on his face as he was chewing. I mean, he looked like it was the tastiest thing he'd ever had on his tongue. One kid threw up, another one fainted, like it was a complete freakout of everyone in class, including the teacher who went totally pale before she barked at him to get his butt down to the principal's office. We never saw that kid again after that. He just disappeared into a puff of smoke, basically, probably because he needed some serious mental help. I still think about that kid from time to time too, and as much as I hope he's doing much better now and has gotten past whatever demons he was dealing with from his childhood, I assume, part of me thinks he just kind of stayed like that, and is probably a little bit dangerous to the rest of society. I mean, like I said, hopefully not, but knowing how some people just never mature after high school, I have my doubts. Okay, so a lot of really weird, really messed up stuff happened back in my high school, but this is probably the most messed up thing because of how it could have ended. We heard this rumor going around one day that someone had brought in a bunch of sleeping pills and had ground them up before putting them in their most hated teacher's lunch. Seemed like some total nonsense to me. Like, how could you even do that without getting caught or whatever? But then as the morning went on, we heard more and more stuff which made it actually seem true. Like how the kids snuck into the teacher's lounge when there were no teachers around, which was unlikely but kind of plausible. Then we heard exactly what kind of sleeping pills it was, which was triazolam. I've never forgotten that word. Then there was a bunch of other stuff too, and in the end, one of my buddies decided, screw it, I can't let this happen. If it was fake, whatever, no big deal, but if it was real, you can do some serious damage to someone with enough sleeping pills, especially if you put them into something that might mask the flavor, like someone's terrible homemade chili or whatever. Didn't expect to hear anything else about it because it's high school, home of where dumb rumors fly around. But then the cops got involved, and we got a big plea for whoever knew who it was to come forward so they could be arrested and charged with like attempted murder or whatever. Then that's the thing. No one came forward. It was all true. Like they tested the food for the drug and yeah, it was triazolam. And no one either admitted to it or snitched on the other person that did it. So basically, the rest of junior year, we were all walking around, going to classes, with an attempted murderer. I say the rest of the year because there was this one kid who didn't come back after summer to complete senior year, and a lot of us figured it was them for some reason. It's still pretty scary to me that a dumb rumor turned out to be a legitimate murder plot, and even scarier that I could have been playing field hockey with that same person and just never have known it. Years ago now, when I was a high school sophomore, someone called in a bomb threat to our school. Instead of evacuating both buildings like I figured they would given the potential number of dead, we were in lockdown for 3 hours, and they condensed all of us in the cafeteria of all places. We later evacuated to the gym, only about 300 feet away, and were stuck there for hours because our parents couldn't get to us. All of our phones were taken because they didn't want us giving information. So there were like 500 moms in SUVs having a heart attack trying to go to the school all at the same time. We learned later that the same threat had been called in to almost every school in the area. There was a robbery at Bank of America while the cops were preoccupied. We were all obviously thankful that it was just a trick, and it's actually kind of smart now that I think about it. But let me tell you, it wasn't funny or smart at the time. We were all absolutely terrified. This happened while I was in my freshman year. My high school had this open campus policy for lunch, and one time, a senior girl left to go get lunch from a mall nearby but never came back. At first, the whole thing was treated as a missing persons case, and as you can probably guess, there were a whole bunch of rumors swirling around concerning what happened to her. People kept insisting that they saw her different places, that she'd run off with her boyfriend, that she was pregnant and her parents were ashamed so they were hiding away. All this crazy stuff, so I didn't know what to believe. We also had all these sick prank calls with kids calling the girl's house pretending to be her. So many that we had a school assembly where the principal and police officers reiterated the seriousness of the situation and basically begged us not to torture her family, who were understandably worried sick. Cut to like months and months later, and these kids found her body rolled up in a carpet under leaves in a relatively well-known hangout spot that high schoolers used to hit up. Because of the location, the Suffolk County PD suspected her killer was actually one of us students, and because of that, they ended up questioning a whole bunch of us who knew her, but they didn't actually arrest anyone. Probably one of the most messed up parts is how I hear younger folks from the same town as me talking about it as if it were some sort of urban legend or whatever. But it's literally in the news for them to read about it, if they just wanted to Google it. During my junior year of high school, I went off on spring break with my family and we went out of state to Orlando for the week. It was an awesome trip. I love Florida and I still do. So does my family, so a good time was had by all. This is before cell phones, so I had no way of knowing what was going on back at home. And if cell phones had been around, there's no way any of the following would have been able to happen. So we went back from Orlando on the Sunday before school and still everything seems fine. But when I went to school the following day, almost everyone was staring at me like they saw a ghost. I'm a huge introvert too, so having like every kid in school staring at me wide-eyed, that was not a pleasant experience, I can assure you. I had kids literally running up to me and hugging me, saying that they were so glad I was okay, and a lot of them I didn't really talk to or even get along with. So naturally I'm thinking, oh God, what's going on? And I get it into my head that they'd all heard something had happened to my mom or dad or something, like maybe they'd had a heart attack or a brain bleed or something, and everyone knew it except me. By the time I actually asked what in God's name was going on, I was absolutely terrified. Basically, just tell me so I can start to deal with it. Just waiting for them to hit me with the bad news. That's when they tell me that in the next town over, there was a kid who was struck by a car and killed while we were gone on spring break. His name was identical to mine, except for one letter in his last name. So everyone who saw it naturally assumed that they spelled the name wrong because that spelling was a very common mistake with my name. I know it sounds crazy to think that they might not know about my dead parents before me, but you gotta put yourself in my shoes and understand how weird and nerve-wracking it was to have all that happening to me. It's maybe not the most scariest thing you've ever heard, but I can promise you, my anxiety was through the roof that morning, and I just feel terrible for that other kid's family. When I was in high school, there was a rumor going around that our principal had killed a woman he was having an affair with and gotten away with it. I remember going home and telling my mom and older sister about it, and obviously they were pretty outraged by the whole thing, so they started doing some major research on the guy, and it turned out to be a false alarm. The whole affair thing was true, hence why he was a suspect. But it turned out he'd been investigated for it a whole bunch and then been acquitted based on two things. One, there were other suspects, as she'd been sleeping around with a few different married men. And two, there was a total lack of evidence. I always figured it was just a nasty rumor, as the principal was the super calm, quiet guy who was always nice and smiling, the kind of guy that seemed like he wouldn't hurt a fly. Years later, after I graduated, there was big news headlines that the guy had been rearrested based on DNA evidence, as that was a relatively new thing at that time. The case went back to court and he was actually convicted. As it turned out, all the skin under her fingernails was his. He had 100% killed that woman and just went about his life all calm and cool. I guess he figured he'd never be convicted for it. But guess what? He was wrong. There was a total psycho I went to high school with. We'll just call him Johnny for the sake of anonymity. Johnny had a reputation for being a bad kid. He was always getting into fights, getting suspended, expelled, then readmitted into school, etc. Ours was the only high school for miles around in rural Ohio, and I think the others had some serious behavioral problems of their own, so for some reason he was let back in once he'd been expelled. Anyways, all throughout junior year, his locker was just a few over from mine, and I remember making serious efforts not to make eye contact with him whenever we were in close proximity. One day, another kid, Jamie, and Johnny got into a fight near the lockers. It started out as smack talking, then turned into a shoving fight, then turned into an actual fight. They ended up getting separated, but for some reason neither of them were suspended, and they were allowed to just return to school the next day like nothing had happened. For those of you crying out, "Oh, that sounds like an extremely negligent mistake," you'd be 100% right, and here's why. The next day, Jamie was walking past our lockers while Johnny happened to be there too. I heard Jamie make some petty remark, but never expected Johnny to react the way he did, because the next thing I know, he pulled an actual claw hammer out of his locker, ran up behind Jamie, and hit him in the back of the head so hard that blood hit me in the face. I think he hit him with the claw end of the hammer too, because half of Jamie's scalp literally half folded over the back of his head as he was on the floor. Before he had a chance to start ground pounding, a bunch of other students jumped on him and held him down. An ambulance took Jamie to the hospital. His skull was fractured and he had broken ribs too, I think from where he'd hit the floor so hard. But Johnny might have got a kick or two in that I didn't see or don't remember. Thankfully, Jamie survived. It was kind of a gross add-on here. I actually had to get checked out because of the blood exposure. No idea where Johnny went, but I never saw him again after that. And thankfully, they got rid of him for good. So, this one day, back when I was in high school, our whole class heard a loud bang come from the room next door. It didn't sound like anything too scary. Like it honestly sounded like someone could have fallen into a bookcase or something. But it was followed by a teacher running into our room to get our teacher, who was first aid certified. Some kid in the next class had a blank bullet with him for some reason and had been messing around shaking it and saying, "It's only a blank." It was, but those things still have powder and all that kind of stuff inside of them, and as he was shaking it, boom, it activated and then blew the whole tip of his finger off. His fingertip then flew into another kid's head, who then looked down and saw a piece of bloody finger on the floor, and then fainted and hit his head. It was honestly insane. The dumb bullet kid gets taken off to the hospital, while the fainting kid gets looked after until he wakes up and then taken off to the first aid room. One of the girls who was sat at the table looked up at the ceiling tiles and saw a blood splatter, and upon closer inspection, there was dumb kid's fingernail stuck in the tile. Definitely the weirdest and creepiest event that's ever happened in our school. In November 1979, I was a junior in high school. Our school was in an upscale neighborhood, and there were many Iranian families here enjoying a wealthy lifestyle while their kids got an American education. I was close friends with 3 of them, as were my siblings friends with some of them. That same year, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was overrun by revolutionaries. They took about 60 hostages, and for more than a year, the Iranian hostage crisis was daily news. A few days after the takeover, with no progress in getting the hostages released, the U.S. government revoked more than half of the student visas of more than 90% of the Iranian adults living here in the U.S. This was announced on TV news, but as a naive junior in high school, I wasn't paying any attention to such things back then. One day, all of our Iranian friends were just gone. No announcement, no explanation from either our school administrators or even parents. No one really knew until word started to get around that they'd been repatriated. As most of those Iranians who were here in the U.S. were considered to be supporters or allies of the Shah, revolutionary courts executed thousands of them. Many whole families just disappeared when they arrived back in Iran. So, a few weeks later, I happened to catch a news report while sitting down with my mother and siblings at dinner, and Mom asked me to turn off the TV. I walked over and they showed a whole bunch of men being hung, stopped dead when I recognized one of the Iranian students was a senior. I didn't know him, but I recognized him, and then looking down the row, I realized his father and brother were among the 12 or so being hung. It was then that I realized that it was probably the fate of my friends as well. I collapsed on the living room floor, and my mom got irritated that the TV wasn't turned off and came into the living room to find me in tears on the floor. It's been 35 years, and every once in a while I open my high school yearbook and look at the names and faces of my old friends. I get choked up, tightness in my throat, a few tears come to my eyes, as I consider the fear they felt as they were pawns and expendables in a political battle they really had nothing to do with. Rest in peace, my friends. We had this kid who was super angry about his ex-girlfriend getting with this new guy, so he hatches this plan to shoot the new guy right in front of her. The class was all lined up outside for gym, and he walks up to the guy, goes to pull the gun out of his pants, accidentally hit the trigger, and shoots himself through his own thigh. He ran just far enough to collapse on my English teacher's doorstep. He actually survived the whole accidental shooting, but he was expelled afterward and no one ever saw him again. He must have moved towns with his family too, because it's weird that no one ever saw him. He must have also been involved in some gang activity for that to even seem like a normal thing to do in his mind, but it was terrifying to think that someone could arrive to that position so easily. Back when I was in high school, these 2 girls were fighting over a boy. It started when they were in the bathroom together, right at the same stall, trying to have a private conversation about it while just totally screaming at one another. Then they actually started fighting, and while they were going at it, one of the girls took out a pair of scissors and stabbed the other in the eye. The girl who stabbed her was expelled, and the other girl lost her eye, but she went back to school like everything was normal. Seriously, they wore this flesh-colored eye patch for the rest of her time there. The creepy part was my classroom was the closest one to the bathroom, and we didn't hear anything. We just saw the cops. It creeps me out to think that it happened a couple of feet away from me, and we seriously didn't even know anything was happening. There must be some seriously thick walls in that place. Now, you gotta keep in mind I didn't transfer in until after this happened, so I only hear about it from a friend later on, but they were right there in the room when it happened. During our ninth grade year, one of the guys in the theater drama class had been threatening to take his own life and to hurt friends and classmates. She and all her friends went to the teachers and the principal about the guy, but were told they couldn't do anything because he had no history of that kind of bad behavior, and therefore, he had to actually do something first before they did anything about it. This is the 1987-1988 year too, so way before any of the safety or counseling stuff that came after Columbine. Anyway, time goes by, and things get more and more intense, and then one day, he actually did it. The kid just walked in mid-class and took the entire room hostage, including my friend and her friends who had reported his threats. He brandished his dad's gun around over and over, pointing it at people and stuff. And then, when one kid tried to talk him down, they pointed the gun at him and actually shot him. The way my friend tells it, it looked like the kid got shot in the face and everyone just started screaming like they'd watched someone instantly die in front of them. Luckily, the kid just lost his ear, but not his life, thankfully. She was still giving legal depositions about the guy about 2 years later when I first met her, which is how I hear the story. Some kids were just straight up traumatized by it and had to transfer schools because they couldn't go to where they'd seen it all happen. It makes me feel very lucky that I wasn't there that day or had transferred to that high school in freshman year. Back when I was still in high school, us seniors had to do a senior project. It could be pretty much anything we wanted it to be. All we had to do was plan it out and follow through, then show our teacher how we'd planned it, executed it, the difficulties we'd faced, and what we'd learned from it as a result. Or maybe executed is a very poor choice of word for me to use, and you'll see why in a minute. So, there was this one kid, real popular and well-liked, and a part of his project was using the classroom intercom thing to make an end-of-day announcement that the next morning he'd be in the student parking lot for a part of his project, and he needed as many other people to be there as possible. Students, teachers, faculty members, friends of family of all the above, it didn't matter. He just needed as large a crowd as possible. We're all super curious about what he's about to do, so naturally, a bunch of rumors go around and hype keeps building as we're trying to figure out what it might be. The next day, a pretty big crowd is gathered as he drives into the student parking lot, myself included. We watch as he sets up a tripod and a camera, and as he's testing it out and stuff, even more people start showing up because they're curious about what's going on. Then maybe around 15 minutes or so before the first bell, we see him hit record, and he lets us know, silently with this big smile, that he just set the camera to record. He thanks everyone for showing up, tells us we're not going to be disappointed. Then he starts heading over to his car, which was just a few feet from where he'd set his camera up. Literally no one saw what he grabbed out of it. Otherwise, I think we'd all have panicked and scattered. But I guess he just did a real good job of concealing what was in his hand, because when he stepped in front of the camera, he pulled the gun from behind his back, put it to his own head, and pulled the trigger. We were just completely stunned. As you can guess, chaos broke loose after that. Kids were screaming, calling 911, literally sprinting away from the scene. It was insanity. No one knows why he did it either. He didn't leave a note, and he didn't even seem depressed. He was a great guy with a bright future too, and I'm not ruling it out, but we didn't hear anything weird or dark come out about him after he died. I guess you don't know what struggles others are going through. I think about it frequently and take that into consideration and try to be nice to others because, like I said, you just never know what's going on inside another person's head. This is a story from my high school days, probably the worst thing I've ever actually seen with my own eyes. There was a special needs kid who actually drowned in my swim class. None of the caretakers kept an eye on him at that time, and he drifted off into the deep end. No one had seen him until the lifeguard had to dive in and get him. From what I know, the lifeguard was fired. I can't say if the caretakers were fired too. Having journalists find us outside of the school by the parking lot and asking us questions about what happened was almost worse than seeing the dead kid being pulled out of the pool. They just didn't care how upset or hurt we were. They just wanted a good story. The year 1990 was a terrible year for the people of the former Yugoslavia. Following the fall of the Soviet Union and the subsequent downfall of European communism, the unity of the multinational Yugoslavs began to slowly unravel. There had always been a degree of animosity between Serbs, Croats, Albanians, and Bosnians, but as ethnic tensions simmered away following various political confrontations, a violent, xenophobic conflagration seemed almost inevitable. One particular event that preceded this inter-ethnic conflict was the segregation of high schools in an area known as Kosovo. Serbian political leaders believed they needed to protect the integrity of their culture and language, insisting it was superior to the region's ethnic groups. Therefore, in their minds, the decision to exclude other nationalities from Serbian schools was the only possible course of action. Yet shortly following this decision, a series of bizarre and terrifying events began to occur. Events that continue to remain shrouded in mystery even all these years later. On March 20th of 1990, in the Kosovan city of Pudujevo, the students of the Juro Djokovic High School filed into their class to begin their daily lessons. The morning was mostly uneventful, but as the day wore on, more and more of the children began to complain that they felt unwell. Suddenly, a rapid onset of horrifying symptoms began to affect the children, especially those that had noticed a fine white powder on their desks at some point during the day. They began to suffer cramps, with some even passing out before frothing at the mouth. When they woke up again, they complained of having vivid and terrible nightmares and were quickly admitted to the hospital. Then as the days went by, school absences increased dramatically as more and more of the Kosovo's schools began to notice identical symptoms among their students. By March 22nd, over 200 students of the Podojevo's various schools had displayed symptoms of the illness, and a deep panic had set in among the residents as more and more of them began to suffer from the mysterious and terrifying illness. That same day, the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Pristina, Kosovo's capital city, convened to address the public with a prepared statement. They announced that they believed the region was in the grip of an epidemic, but refused to give any information until they had properly analyzed blood and urine samples that had been taken from the victims. Yet when the test results of the samples came back, they failed to provide a solid conclusion on what was occurring. According to Pristina University's Faculty of Medicine, the only thing they could rule out was the possibility of some kind of poison being to blame. However, this struck some medical professionals as being very strange indeed. A doctor named Baron Cohen, who was a member of a human rights organization known as the Helsinki Federation, said it was impossible for the doctors at Pristina University to come to such a conclusion so quickly. According to him, it would take a properly staffed laboratory up to 6 weeks to correctly analyze such samples, while it seemed to have taken Pristina just a matter of days. Dr. Cohen's statements was then refuted by a Serbian doctor by the name of Balosevic, who went on local Serbian TV to make a rather eerie statement. He claimed that the events in Kosovo were all about acting for the Cannes Film Festival, and accused the Albanian doctors who had noticed the illness of participating in a children's masquerade. This sentiment was echoed by other Serbian doctors who asserted what had occurred was nothing more than mass hysteria. Later that year, Kosovo's chief of epidemiology fiercely denied that the disease had a psychological basis. As a result of these denials, he was arrested and was held by Serbian police for 5 days. When he was finally released, he claimed to have discovered a secret microphone which had been hidden away in his office, and became convinced that some kind of dangerous conspiracy was afoot. Two other doctors who had similarly asserted that something deliberate and frightening was occurring received death threats from anonymous members of the public. Another was arrested for echoing their concerns and was only released after heavy international pressure. The poisoning theory then seemed to be confirmed by a French doctor by the name of Bernard Benedetti, who confirmed the presence of poison in the victim's blood during an interview with the newspaper, the La Course. He claimed to have visited the same Serbian-run laboratory which performed the initial tests, secretly obtaining his own set of victims' blood samples in the process. After attempting to raise the alarm with French authorities, Dr. Benedetti claimed that he was completely ignored by the relevant public bodies and believed their reluctance to take action was motivated by their fear of soaring diplomatic relations with Serbia. Another non-governmental organization, Commission of Geneva, dispatched representatives to Kosovo to find out the truth, and although they didn't take blood samples, their findings were highly disturbing. Instead of taking or analyzing tissue samples directly, they instead compiled a list of symptoms shared by the Kosovan victims. This is how they discovered that many of the students seemed to smell like vinegar when they arrived at various hospitals. According to them, this was an indication that the poisoning had been caused by some kind of organic phosphate, in other words, nerve gas. This prognosis was reinforced in February of 1992 when a chemical weapons expert released a statement to the press. He agreed that some kind of poison had been deployed against innocent schoolchildren, but that it had a chemical structure more in line with an herbicide than with a weapons-grade nerve agent. As more and more attention was drawn to the poisonings, Serbian officials rushed to label the entire affair as a case of mass hysteria, and that spurious evidence had been concocted by Albanian separatists. Yet instead of producing their own evidence with proof of anything of the contrary, Serbian police not only obstructed medical services, such as confiscating drivers' licenses from ambulance drivers, but they ordered the medical records of the poisoned patients to be destroyed. Some patients and physicians were even interrogated and mistreated while in police custody, and despite Albanian doctors appealing to the government to establish an independent and impartial international investigation, the demands were rejected. Then, something equally disturbing occurred. A few months after the poisonings, a medical symposium was due to be held in Zagreb, the capital city of neighboring Croatia. It was here that a famous Croatian biochemist, Dr. Franko Plavšić, was due to present the results of his analyses of the blood and urine which he had taken from patients with the mysterious affliction. Yet, just before he was due to arrive at the symposium, Dr. Plavšić seemed to drop off the face of the earth and has never been heard from since. One of his colleagues admitted that Dr. Plavšić had received a number of death threats as a result of his research into the poisonings, and openly stated that he feared the man had been killed. After Dr. Plavšić's disappearance, talk of the poisonings finally abated, as it seemed his colleagues had been suitably intimidated into silence. Then, over the 18 months that followed, regional headlines were swallowed up by the outbreak of the Yugoslav Civil War, a series of ethnic conflicts, wars of independence, and insurgencies that resulted in the deaths of around 140,000 people. War crimes were rife. The international community was forced to intervene on a number of different occasions, and the huge effect the war had on the European community is almost immeasurable. After events like the Srebrenica massacre, people simply moved on from the Kosovan poisonings, and they became a footnote in a much larger, much more brutal conflict. Yet I think we can all agree that it's important that we remember some of the first victims of the war, a group of innocent high schoolers who only ever wanted to get an education, but instead of learning about math, science, or the arts, the only lesson they received that day was how cruel and vicious mankind can be. In Collinwood, Ohio, there's a beautiful old memorial garden where the Lakeview High School had once stood. Constructed in the late 19th century, the school hosted hundreds of local teenagers whose daily attendance was their ticket to productive, successful lives. Yet one fateful day in 1908, a terrible incident occurred which meant that scores of them would never return home again. That event has gone in history as one of the deadliest school disasters ever recorded, an event which has come to be known as the Collinwood School Fire. What caused the conflagration remains somewhat unclear, yet in the aftermath, there was a great deal of speculation among local citizens and local media. Some of the newspapers suggested that the building's janitor, Fritz Herder, was to blame for running the boiler too hot. Others blamed girls smoking in a basement closet near flammable materials. Yet a coroner's inquest concluded that heating pipes running next to exposed wooden joists ignited the building, which meant that no one could be held legally accountable for it. However, many parents were suspicious of how quickly the inquest was carried out and violently objected to its refusal to hold the school board, the architects, or anyone else responsible. Ohio's chief inspector of public buildings explained the problem in his annual report to the governor and citizens, saying that the cause of the fire cannot be determined. Many believed it originated from the heating systems or boilers, but proof has been offered to the contrary. The only thing we know for certain is that whatever caused the fire, it transformed the Lakeview High School from a place of learning into an inferno. You see, with regards to how it was designed and constructed, the school was nothing short of a deadly fire trap. During the course of the blaze, the school's masonry exterior acted as a kind of chimney, sucking the flames upwards as the wooden interior burned. Open stairways in the absence of fire breaks enhanced the chimney effect, effectively roasting escaping students with white-hot temperatures as they attempted to flee. On top of that, the school had only 2 exits, and it's thought that the fire quickly blocked one of them off, leading to a mass crush near the only functioning means of escape. As children rushed to the rear door of the school, they were greeted by a lobby that was narrowed by partitions, causing a horrific bottleneck effect. As they struggled and screamed, students began stumbling and falling, forcing others to climb over them in order to escape. Some accounts describe children being pinned against inward swinging doors, meaning that no matter how much they pushed, the crush meant that there was simply no means of escaping the smoke and flames. At the time of the fire, Collinwood's small volunteer fire department were equipped with nothing but horse-drawn engines, meaning they arrived too late to battle the inferno. In less than an hour, the 3 floors and the roof of the Lakeview School collapsed into the basement, leaving only a hollowed-out, scorched brick ruin. And by the time it was over 170 students, 2 teachers, and 1 first responder had been roasted alive or suffocated. In the aftermath, the town of Collinwood paid for the burial of 19 unidentifiable bodies in a shared grave at Cleveland's Lakeview Cemetery. After crews tore down the ruins of the school, disputes over the use of the land soon flared up. The school board had initially planned to build a new school on the site of the tragedy, arguing it was the most efficient and financially conservative course of action. Yet mourning parents were outraged by the proposal, and some also filed lawsuits to prevent this from happening. The dispute lasted more than a year, but by the end of it, the state of Ohio pledged to pay for the land where the Lakeview School had stood before turning it into a memorial garden. The new Collinwood Memorial School, built to the highest standards of contemporary fire safety, was constructed on an adjacent lot, overlooking the place where the smoldering ruin had once stood. All in all, the fire needlessly took the lives of an obscene number of young people, and it was an event which need never have occurred if the school had been constructed in the manner we're accustomed to today. We can only imagine how utterly terrifying it must have been to be trapped in the school that day, trying with all your might to escape, but knowing your efforts were useless. Faced with the hellish visions of flame and smoke, all a person could do was scream, panic, and wait for the world around them to go dark. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to always brush your teeth.